January 1942. The Pacific air is heavy, unmoving. On a captured airstrip in the Philippines, the war has already settled into routine, guards posted, rifles slung low, boots grinding dust into the ground. Behind barbed wire, American prisoners sit in rows. Thin, unshaven, silent, Japanese soldiers watch them closely. They had been taught to expect cruelty in return. Brutality. Starvation as revenge. In their training, surrender itself was a moral collapse. A man who laid down his weapon was already dead, but something does not fit, metal containers are opened. Ladles move. Steam rises. The smell is unmistakable, rice, vegetables, measured portions of meat. Enough to live on. Enough to endure. Not abundance, but intention. The guards exchange glances. Some stare too long. Others look away. This is not how captivity was supposed to look. Not according to doctrine. Not according to experience in China. Not according to the logic of a war that had already erased millions. In the space between expectation and reality, a quiet shock takes hold. And that moment, small, almost invisible, will ripple far beyond the wire, into how this war is remembered, judged, and understood. Long before the first American soldier was captured in the Pacific, the idea of surrender had already been settled in the Japanese mind. It was not written in a single manual, but absorbed through years of training, ritual, and repetition. The Imperial Japanese Army entered the Second World War carrying a cultural framework shaped by Bushido, a warrior ethic that elevated endurance, obedience, and death before dishonor. In this worldview, capture was not misfortune. It was disgrace. A soldier who surrendered forfeited his honor, his family name, and his place in history. This belief had practical consequences. In the long war in China that began in 1937, Japanese forces had fought an enemy that rarely took prisoners and rarely expected mercy in return. Brutality escalated not as an accident, but as a system. Prisoners were often viewed as logistical burdens rather than human assets. Food was scarce. Transport was difficult. Discipline was enforced through violence. Over time, cruelty became normalized, not celebrated openly, but accepted as necessary. By 1941, this mindset was deeply embedded at every level of command. When Japan turned south and east after Pearl Harbor, its soldiers carried these assumptions with them. They expected the same rules to apply to Western enemies. In their logic, an American or British soldier who surrendered had already abandoned his duty. There was no moral obligation to preserve him beyond usefulness. But the Pacific War introduced a contradiction. Beyond usefulness, but the Pacific War introduced a contradiction. The United States, unlike many of Japan's previous adversaries, entered the war with a formal doctrine governing prisoners of war. American military policy was tied, at least in principle, to the 1929 Geneva Convention, which Japan had signed but never fully ratified. For U.S. commanders, POWs were not expendable. They were evidence of discipline. Proof of civilization under pressure. This difference would not be theoretical for long. In December 1941 and January 1942, Japanese forces overran American positions across the Pacific. Wake Island fell. Guam followed. In the Philippines, General Douglas MacArthur's forces were pushed back toward Bataan and Corregidor. Thousands of American and Filipino troops were captured in a matter of weeks. For Japanese soldiers on the ground, these prisoners were an anomaly. They did not beg. They did not collapse into submission. They expected rations, medical care, order, and more unsettling still, they sometimes received it. In early encounters, Japanese guards observed American camps run with structure even in defeat. Officers attempted to maintain hierarchy. Food, when available, was distributed according to regulation. Not generosity, but procedure. It was a behavior pattern unfamiliar to an army that equated surrender with erasure. This clash of assumptions did not explode immediately. It simmered, because behind every guarded camp stood two invisible forces moving in opposite directions: Japan's belief that mercy weakened soldiers, and America's belief that restraint proved strength. And as the war expanded across oceans and islands, those forces were about to collide more directly, inside the daily routines of captivity. While Japanese soldiers struggled to reconcile surrender with survival, American military doctrine was shaped by a different inheritance. The United States Army entered the Second World War carrying lessons from the First. In Europe between 1917 and 1918, the handling of prisoners had become a matter of international scrutiny, logistics, and law. By 1941, American planners viewed POW management not as an act of mercy, but as an extension of discipline. Prisoners were to be fed enough to work, sheltered enough to survive, and recorded enough to be accounted for. This was not idealism. It was systems thinking. American rations were designed with calories, not punishment, in mind. Quartermasters calculated intake based on labor output and disease prevention. Even under strain, food distribution followed tables and manuals. A starving prisoner was a liability, weak, sick, unproductive, and prone to death that required explanation. When American forces began capturing Axis troops in North Africa in late 1942, these principles were put into practice at scale. German and Italian prisoners were fed standardized rations, often comparable to those issued to rear echelon troops. Reports from the period note surprise among Axis POWs, not at luxury, but at consistency. Meals arrived on schedule. Medical inspections occurred regularly. Work details were organized, not improvised. Japanese military observers would eventually become aware of this system, but in the early years of the war, information traveled unevenly. Japan's intelligence assessments of American POW policy were fragmented. Pre-war assumptions painted Western armies as soft, indulgent, and morally lax. There was little expectation that an enemy so willing to surrender would maintain discipline afterward. When Japanese personnel encountered American-run camps, especially during temporary transfers, inspections, or exchanges, the reality conflicted sharply with expectation. Food became the most visible symbol of this contradiction. American POW camps were not comfortable. Rations were often reduced due to shipping constraints. Meat was scarce. Fresh vegetables came and went with supply lines. But meals were planned. Calories were counted. Starvation was not a tool. To Japanese soldiers accustomed to scarcity even within their own ranks, this appeared incomprehensible. In the Imperial Japanese Army, frontline units frequently operated on minimal rations. Soldiers supplemented meals through foraging. Hunger was normalized, even glorified, as proof of endurance. Officers ate little more than enlisted men. Suffering was not a failure of logistics, it was a test of character. So when Japanese guards saw American prisoners receiving steady meals, a quiet comparison formed. Why were defeated men eating better than victorious soldiers? The question carried danger. It undermined authority. It invited resentment. It exposed a fracture between ideology and outcome. Some officers dismissed it as propaganda or temporary indulgence. Others reacted by tightening control, reducing rations, or enforcing harsher discipline to reassert hierarchy, but the image lingered. Because food, in war, is never just nourishment. It is power. It signals who is expected to survive and who is not. And as Japanese troops continued to encounter American captivity practices, directly or through reports, the tension between these two systems began to shape behavior on both sides of the wire, setting the stage for moments of confrontation, confusion, and moral collision. For many Japanese soldiers, the first encounter with American prisoners was not dramatic. It happened quietly, in the margins of routine. A guard assigned to a fence line. An officer overseeing a ration count. A sentry watching men eat. What unsettled them was not defiance. It was normalcy. American prisoners queued in lines. They waited. They received bowls. Some spoke softly. Others stared ahead. Hunger was visible, but not desperation. These were men who expected to eat again tomorrow. In Japanese training, this expectation did not exist. Soldiers were taught to endure uncertainty without complaint. To survive without assurance. To accept deprivation as proof of loyalty. Watching captured enemies receive predictable meals disrupted that internal logic. Some guards felt anger. Others felt disbelief. A few felt something closer to envy. Japanese military culture placed enormous weight on self-denial. Discipline was internalized through suffering. A soldier who endured hunger without protest demonstrated strength. A prisoner who was fed adequately appeared to be rewarded for failure. This inversion struck at the core of honor-based thinking. If surrender led to survival, and survival included food, then the moral hierarchy collapsed. Officers worried less about the prisoners themselves and more about what their treatment signaled to their own men. To feed the defeated was to risk weakening the victorious. Confusion followed. Some Japanese personnel interpreted American food practices as manipulation, an attempt to extract labor or cooperation. Others suspected deception, assuming rations would eventually be cut as punishment, but day after day, meals continued. This consistency created cognitive dissonance. It challenged the belief that mercy and strength could not coexist. For some, it hardened attitudes. For others, it planted doubt, not sympathy. Doubt. And doubt, in a rigid military system, was dangerous. As these reactions accumulated across camps and commands, they began to influence how policies were interpreted, enforced, or quietly altered, pushing the war's moral tension closer to an unavoidable test. From a purely operational perspective, prisoners represented labor. Roads had to be built. Airstrips repaired. Supplies moved. The Japanese army, stretched across vast distances, depended heavily on manpower. Feeding prisoners enough to work made sense on paper, but ideology interfered. Officers struggled to balance utility with punishment. Too much food risked resentment among Japanese troops already living on reduced rations. Too little food rendered prisoners useless. The result was inconsistency. Some camps adhered to minimum sustenance, others drifted towards starvation, often depending on the personal beliefs of the commanding officer. American camps, by contrast, emphasized predictability. Work was expected, but rations were tied to output, not emotion. This system appeared cold, even bureaucratic, yet it produced stability. To Japanese observers, this mechanized fairness felt alien. Leadership revealed the sharpest contrast. American camp commandants were evaluated on order, sanitation, and reporting accuracy. A dead prisoner raised questions. An underfed one invited inspection. Authority was maintained through regulation. Japanese officers maintained authority through fear and example. Orders were enforced through punishment. Respect was demanded, not measured. Feeding prisoners adequately could be perceived as weakness, or worse, disloyalty to the spirit of the army. This divergence meant that individual leaders shaped outcomes dramatically. One camp could function with grim stability. Another could descend into cruelty. Both existed within the same war. Beneath tactics and leadership lay a moral confrontation that neither side openly acknowledged. The Americans believed restraint demonstrated superiority. The Japanese believed endurance defined worth. Each system judged the other as flawed, yet the presence of food, measured, rationed, intentional. Forced to question neither ideology had prepared for. Could humanity exist without undermining victory? The war would not answer this question gently, because as battles intensified and supply lines collapsed, the treatment of prisoners would move from observation to consequence, reaching a point where choices made in camps echoed into survival rates, memory, and judgment, and that turning point was approaching. By mid-1942, the war in the Pacific had shifted from rapid conquest to brutal strain. Japan's early victories had stretched its supply lines thin. Fuel was rationed. Shipping lanes were contested. Rice, once assumed plentiful, became scarce even for frontline units. Soldiers who had advanced across Southeast Asia now found themselves isolated on islands with irregular resupply and declining morale. It was under these conditions that the contradiction surrounding prisoners became impossible to ignore. In several occupied areas, particularly in the Philippines and later on captured islands, Japanese officers conducted inspections of POW camps, comparing notes, inventories, and ration logs. Reports noted something uncomfortable. American prisoners, though weakened, were surviving at higher-than-expected rates when food distribution remained structured. Disease existed, but mass collapse had not yet occurred. Food was doing what punishment could not. It was preserving life. For some commanders, this realization provoked anger. They interpreted prisoner survival as defiance. Men who should have been broken were enduring. In response, rations were reduced. Work hours increased. Discipline hardened. The balance tilted from utility toward retribution. In other commands, the opposite occurred. A small number of Japanese officers, often logisticians rather than combat leaders, recognized that starving prisoners created chaos. Sick men slowed projects. Corpses required burial. Disease spread beyond the wire. In these camps, food allocations were quietly stabilized, sometimes against unofficial expectations. The tension between these approaches reached a breaking point during periods of transfer. As prisoners were moved between camps, by rail, ship, or forced march, Japanese guards observed American insistence on carrying ration records, medical notes, even improvised mess schedules. These details, mundane and bureaucratic, felt absurd in the context of a collapsing supply network, yet they worked. Japanese soldiers guarding transports often ate less than the men they escorted. This fact was noticed. Resentment grew. Some guards responded with violence. Others with withdrawal. A few with silence. At the same time, American intelligence began documenting the disparity. Survivors later testified that moments of relative food stability created brief psychological resistance, enough to keep men alive long enough to witness what followed, because as 1942 turned into 1943, the war's pressure intensified, and with it, patience evaporated. The question was no longer whether prisoners should be fed. It was whether the system that fed them could survive the war itself. The decisive shift did not arrive as a single order. It arrived as erosion. By late 1942 and into 1943, Japan's logistical position had deteriorated sharply. Allied submarines cut supply routes. Air superiority chipped away at convoys. Garrisons across the Pacific received less food, less medicine, and fewer replacements. Hunger, once framed as discipline, became unavoidable reality. In this environment, POW camps became mirrors of the larger collapse. Where American captivity doctrine relied on surplus and structure, Japanese camps now operated under scarcity and improvisation. Officers faced impossible choices: feed their men or their prisoners. In many cases, the decision was silent but absolute. Rations were cut. In some camps, the change was gradual. Bowls became lighter. Protein disappeared. In others, it was immediate. Food deliveries stopped altogether for days at a time. Prisoners weakened rapidly. Disease spread unchecked. Dysentery and malaria turned hunger into mortality. The earlier shock, of seeing prisoners fed, gave way to something darker. Japanese guards who had once questioned the system now hardened against it. Survival, not ideology, dictated behavior. Violence increased, not always from cruelty, but from frustration. Authority was enforced more aggressively as morale collapsed, yet the contrast with American practice did not disappear. Captured documents and post-war testimony reveal that even as resources dwindled, some Japanese officers remained aware of international scrutiny. They kept partial records. They attempted minimal compliance. These efforts rarely reached the prisoners themselves, but they indicate that the earlier encounters with American captivity had left a mark. Food, once symbolic, now became a weapon by absence. For prisoners, memory sharpened around meals. A ladle scraping the bottom of a pot. A guard turning away. The sound of cooking that never came. Men who had survived months on regulated rations now watched that structure dissolve. This was the turning point. Not because it reversed policy everywhere, but because it revealed the truth behind it. The system that had once shocked Japanese troops with its restraint could not exist in isolation. It depended on resources, logistics, and institutional will, and when those collapsed, the war stripped captivity down to its rawest form. What followed would be counted not in ideology, but in numbers, dead, missing, and remembered, forcing both sides to confront the consequences of how prisoners were treated when the world stopped watching. When the war finally began to turn decisively against Japan, the condition of prisoners emerged from the shadows with devastating clarity. As Allied forces advanced in 1944 and 1945, they overran camps across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. What they found varied sharply. Some camps held emaciated survivors barely able to stand. Others were silent, marked only by shallow graves and abandoned tools. The differences between them told a story not of a single policy, but of fragmentation, of decisions made under pressure, without oversight, and often without mercy. Military reports compiled immediately after liberation documented survival rates that correlated directly with food availability. Camps that had maintained even minimal ration structure. Rice, watery soup, occasional vegetables, showed higher survival. Camps where rations collapsed entirely became sites of mass death. Numbers replaced theory. In the Philippines, on the Burma-Thailand Railway, and across island garrisons, malnutrition emerged as the leading cause of POW mortality, often compounded by disease and forced labor. The earlier shock experienced by Japanese soldiers, of prisoners being fed, now seemed almost distant, overshadowed by the scale of suffering. For American commanders, the contrast reinforced long-held beliefs. Reports emphasized that food discipline was not kindness, but control. Men who ate survived. Men who survived testified. This mattered, because as evidence accumulated, Allied investigators began preparing for accountability. Medical officers recorded weights, symptoms, and mortality timelines. Quartermasters documented ration shortfalls. Survivors described moments when food had disappeared, and the speed with which men followed. Japanese officers captured late in the war often expressed surprise at the focus placed on food in interrogations. To them, hunger had been universal. But Allied investigators treated it as choice, not fate. The distinction was critical, because where food had been used as a tool of discipline or neglect, responsibility could be traced. Orders might not have existed, but patterns did. And those patterns pointed toward command decisions made long before the war collapsed completely. As tribunals loomed, the treatment of prisoners, once a marginal concern, moved to the center of how the Pacific War would be judged. In the years immediately following Japan's surrender, the question of responsibility moved from the battlefield to the courtroom. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East, along with numerous regional war crimes trials, examined the treatment of prisoners in exhaustive detail. Testimony returned again and again to food, its absence, its reduction, its deliberate withholding. Survivors described how rations shrank not only with supply failures, but with shifts in attitude. Investigators compared camp records with logistical capacity, identifying moments when deprivation exceeded necessity. Food became evidence. Japanese defendants often argued that shortages affected everyone equally. Some claimed prisoners received the same rations as guards. In a few cases, this was partially true. But tribunal findings emphasized responsibility at the command level. Where officers failed to adapt labor demands to nutrition, or ignored medical warnings, neglect became culpable. The earlier encounters, when Japanese troops had been shocked to see American prisoners fed, took on new meaning. They demonstrated that alternatives had been visible. That restraint had been observed, even if not adopted consistently. for survivors, memory remained sharply focused on meals. Not their taste, but their timing. A bowl of rice that arrived late. A soup that never came. Food marked time more reliably than calendars. It separated hope from resignation. For Japan, the legacy was complicated. Post-war narratives often emphasized suffering at home, firebombed cities, starvation, defeat. The suffering of prisoners existed alongside this memory, sometimes acknowledged, sometimes resisted. But in official records, the evidence endured. The contrast between American and Japanese POW systems did not erase wartime brutality on either side. It clarified something narrower and more precise: how structure, even under pressure, could preserve life or hasten its loss. As decades passed, historians returned to these camps not to count cruelty, but to understand decisions. Why some officers fed prisoners while others did not. Why ideology bent in one place and hardened in another. Those questions do not end with verdicts, they linger, quietly, into how the war itself is remembered. In war, violence is expected. Hunger is quieter. It does not explode or announce itself. It arrives slowly, measured in skipped meals and shrinking portions. In the prisoner camps of the Pacific War, food became more than sustenance. It became a language, spoken through ladles, ration books, and empty pots. For Japanese soldiers raised to equate suffering with strength, the sight of fed prisoners challenged a belief that had shaped their identity. For Americans, the act of feeding captives affirmed a different idea, that discipline could exist without erasure, and that survival itself carried meaning. Neither system was perfect. Both operated under strain. But the difference mattered, because structure endured where chaos did not. The men behind the wire rarely debated ideology. They counted days by meals. They remembered moments when food appeared, and when it vanished. Long after the war ended, those memories remained sharper than battles or speeches. History often turns on grand decisions made in command rooms. Yet here, it turned on something ordinary. A bowl of rice. A measured ration. A choice made under pressure. In those choices, humanity did not triumph completely. But it surfaced, and in a war defined by destruction, that fragile presence, brief, inconsistent, and contested, remains one of the clearest measures of what was lost, what survived, and what still demands remembrance.